We live in strange times. The US Department of Defense says aliens are real. We're currently experiencing one of the hottest summers on record, and Absolute Habibi is posting 3 times a week. But seriously, I do have a lot of content to come, videos just waiting to be edited, and it's my mission in the next couple of months to give you guys that content in an edited format at a minimum 3 times a week. That means lots of multiplayer videos coming, some single player runs incoming, as well as games from other games and genres. In today's video, we will be talking about scaling and building nations in Europa Universalis 4. Many of you guys requested this video in my most recent Spain MP video, so here it is. This guide is intended for multiplayer use, but you can use it for single player runs as well. Just keep in mind that in single player, sometimes the fastest and most economical way to scale your economy is by expanding, while in multiplayer you have to face a player most of the time that might turn into a death war, so eternal expansion is usually better. Before continuing with this guide, I wanted to tell you guys that I'm currently trying to get 50,000 YouTube subscribers, and when I reach 50,000, I will play Sus in a normal 50-player multiplayer lobby. It will probably go horribly wrong or lead to an exodus, but if you want to see it, subscribe and tell all your friends. Alright, so scaling in Europa Universalis is actually not as hard as it seems. One of the best skills to have in this game in both multiplayer and single player is resource management. And speaking about resources, in EU4, your most valuable resources are your mana or monarch points. Money is important, but not as important as monarch points or even manpower. And we'll be discussing a lot of that and how to be as efficient as possible as part of this guide. As mentioned before, mana is our most valuable resource. We have a set amount we can make per month, and it's very valuable to us. So it's first important that we generate as much as possible. We should always be running 1-1-2 advisors at the minimum, focusing mill, then admin, then diplo points in the early game, and later in the game if we aren't expanding, we focus mill, then dip, then admin. Always mill is our first focus. If we can, we should run even higher advisors, as the more mana we can generate, the better. It is okay to be at a deficit in the early game to pay for advisors, as we can easily outscale any debt we take on early on in the game, or at least we should be able to. As our income scales, our advisors should scale as well. We should always take events that give us advisor cost reduction like new men, or just random events that give us 50% discounted advisors. Later in the guide video, we will talk about reducing advisor levels in order to build a set of buildings. Next aspect of mana generation is our ruler. If we are a monarchy, it is very important that we yeet any heirs that are 9 points or lower. Personally, I try to get 12 points or higher, but some consider this greedy. Of course, this does mean we will need a lot of prestige, which is why the burger prestige estate privilege is important, as well as converting and winning wars. You can also get a considerable amount of prestige by having level 3 advisors. If you did not know, advisors all have a one-time per game event associated with them that will give you either a 1 stability or 50 prestige. Most of the time, want to pick the 50 prestige. Having a 2-2-2 ruler for 20 years and a 4-4-4 ruler for 20 years is a 1,440 mana difference. So re-rolling for good rulers is very important. There are also random events associated to having no heir that can give you a good heir, like Lux Stella, as well as scripted heir events like Henry VIII for England and Elizabeth, as well as Isabella for Castile. There's also the Child of Surya event, which you can roll as Hindu and using the Surya deity. And one of the most common events I try to roll the most as a non-Muslim country is Talented and Ambitious Daughter, which is a non-unique event that any non-Muslim country can trigger by having a ruler over the age of 40 and no heir. Later in the game, we can also do the state's general government reform, which gives us 2 ruler options, either every 4 years or on ruler death, depending if we are statist or monarchist. This will on average give us a really good ruler, as we always get 2 options, and if the options are bad, we can go towards status and re-elect in 4 years, or we can make our ruler a general so he has a higher chance of dying. If you are a republic, we want to always re-elect unless our ruler gets bad traits like Craven, but even then, if we are not warring, it's fine, as generating as much mana as possible is more important. Taking the random candidate bonus is recommended, as it will give a random stat to our ruler at start and make him 666 as fast as possible. Another trick we can do is when our ruler does die is that we can keep the screen open for 3 months, gaining the mana from that ruler until we re-elect, and then from there making a new ruler. How do we maintain high Republican tradition? If you do this, you must always pick all events that give Republican Tradition, even if it costs us mana or money, and if it gets below 60 Republican Tradition, we want to spend a little military mana boosting it up, as this is when you start getting negative pulse events. If you are a theocracy, well, early game you just need to pray you get good rulers, as you cannot see the stats of your rulers until later through government reforms. This is the biggest downside to theocracies in the early game, and we should try avoid becoming a theocracy if it's a choice until late game, where we can take advantage of all the really strong government reforms. If you are able to make your rulers generals, you can do this to try to kill bad rulers with low stats. And of course, early game we should take out all the estates for mana points. This is actually more important than selling titles most of the time, and we should always start our game by doing this. The next part of mana generation comes from power projection. Having over 50 power projection gives us 1 point of all stats per month. We can increase power projection by sending insults to our rivals, both regular and scornful insults, embargoing our rivals, privateering our rivals, declaring war on our rivals, doing humiliation or show strength wars, or just outscaling our rivals so they are no longer valid. There are also unique missions that some nations have that give permanent power projection. The next part is events. The most common event that gives mana is an event where you choose between 10 mana or 50 mana and some inflation. We always want to take as much mana as we can, so we will always take the 50 mana option. There are also exploration events associated with exploring the new world with a conquistador, and if you are lucky you can get a significant amount of mana that way. The last part of mana generation is getting mana through show strength wars. This is really only valid in early stages of the game, as when you are small it's a lot easier to get off consecutive show strength wars. If you do not know what a show strength war is, it is when you declare a humiliation war versus a rival and take show strength option in the peace deal for 100% war score. This option gives 100 of all points, which is quite significant. This mechanic is great if you start as a small nation like Brandenburg or Florence, especially since you cannot expand too fast due to aggressive expansion. However, even if you are a bigger nation, if there's an opportunity for an easy show strength war, we should always take it. In places like Japan, we can do up to 9 show strengths in the early game, which is a total of 2,700 points. Now that we're generating a lot of mana, we need to talk about using mana efficiently. As we mentioned before, monarch points are our most valuable resource, so not only do we want to make as much of it as possible, we also want to spend it as efficiently as possible. In this section, we will not be talking about developing, as that is its own section later in the video. Instead, we will be talking about all the other ways we can spend our monarch points more efficiently. The most basic way to spend your mana efficiently is to not take tech ahead of time. You should always wait for the -5% or -10% tech cost reduction bonuses due to neighbors having the tech first. As long as you take the tech as soon as it becomes -5 or -10, you will not lose innovativeness, and you will maintain the ahead of time bonus, such as the trade efficiency and production efficiency bonuses for being ahead of time in tech. In my opinion, this is one of the biggest mistakes noobs make. They always feel like being ahead of everyone first in tech is important and overvalue InnoGain, and always spend heaping amounts of mana on taking techs early, and because of that fall behind in developing and ideas. You can also reduce the cost of tech at Dip Tech 9 by having a spy network. The study technology tech at Dip Tech 9 allows you to get a tech reduction for tech already taken on the person you have a spy network on. The tech reduction is increased the bigger the spy network. If we're playing with vanilla institutions, we want to stay on top of the institutions for this exact reasons. However, we do not want to develop for institutions unless we absolutely have to. In multiplayer, it's better to buy an institution and put institution growth in capital while doing so, or even conquering someone who has an institution than developing it ourselves. Of course, stacking military points is important, and having the ability to take mil tech early is always good, as we can take military tech early in order to get an advantage in a player war. Again though, we do not want to take the mil tech early unless we absolutely have to, which is why sometimes if you watch me play, you'll see me stacking 600 to 700 mil points plus at all times. I also want to be as efficient as possible with core cost reduction to save admin. This obviously is more important for single player blobbing runs, but is also important playing tall or playing multiplayer. We can reduce the cost of coring easiest by making claims or just conquering through claims. Keep in mind, permanent claims from mission trees give higher core cost reduction than normal claims, and sometimes it's okay to not take 100% peace deals on land if there are other things we need to spend admin on. What we can also do is instead releasing vassals, but keep in mind we're actually trading admin spending for diplo spending for annexing those vassals later. If we can, we want to stack as much tech cost reduction and idea cost reduction, as the less we spend on those, the more we can spend on developing, which is our next section of this video. Here's where things get a little sweaty. Developing is a core part of scaling in multiplayer as well as playing tall, as conquest usually involves long drawn out player wars, and we can actually stack a considerable amount of dev cost reduction even if we have no ideas or policies for dev cost reduction. Here's all the dev cost reduction you can stack in EU4 without ideas or policies. Your burger estate has over 60% loyalty. Level 2 trade centers give minus 5% dev cost reduction in a province, while level 3 trade centers give minus 10% dev cost reduction in the entire state. Capitals have 5% dev cost reduction per 100 country development. Each level of expand infrastructure gives 15% dev cost, which stacks. Temples give minus 5% dev cost reduction if we take the development of temples, clergy, estate privilege. Get between 0 to negative 33 dev cost from inwards perfection, clergy, estate privilege as an Eastern religion group, depending on how much land the clergy own. In Korea, you can get 5 dev cost reduction by choosing inwards focused government interaction. Get 20 dev cost reduction from a university in a province. And get another 20 dev cost by inviting minorities gov interaction as a feudal theocracy. If you own a steppe province and have the Cossacks estate, you can get minus 15 dev costs in those steppes by taking the Cossacks exploration expedition estate privilege. Get minus 10 dev costs from either cloth or cotton trade good on the province. As Emperor of China, you can give the decree expand palace bureaucracy, which gives 10 dev cost reduction. If you have economic ideas in parliament, you can activate land reforms parliament debate for 10 dev cost reduction. I believe this also could be triggered with infrastructure ideas, but I'm not really sure. 3 cities in the HRE get minus 20 dev cost reduction as their first government reform. If you are Orthodox, you can take the icon of Christ Pantocrator for 10 dev cost reduction. If you are Muslim, you can be Meliki or invite the Meliki scholar for 10 dev cost reduction. If you are Shinto and stay at level 4 isolationism, closed doors, you can get minus 10 dev cost. If you are Confucianist, you can get 10 dev cost reduction for being 100 harmony. It is minus 0.2 dev cost for each point over 50. If you are Tengu, you can make Theravada a syncretic faith for another minus 10 dev cost. If you are Fetishist, you can make Buddhism your cult for minus 10% dev cost. You can also stack this modifier for another 10% by embracing singular cult clergy privilege. Anglican gets minus 10 just for being Anglican. And Vanilla Dev Edict gives minus 10% dev cost. Prosperity gives also another minus 10% dev cost reduction. You get minus 5% total dev cost modifier in your nation for trading in tropical wood. Theocracies can get minus 5 dev cost reduction from their tier 9 government reform, expulsion of heathens. You get 5 additional dev cost reduction for embracing Renaissance globally. Provinces in the HRE get 5 dev cost for the first HRE reform. Catholics can get 5 dev cost reduction if the Christiana Pietis Golden Bull is activated. If you have a tropical province, you can do tropical city planning from your burger's estate for an additional 5% dev cost. If you're Indian, Jains have an estate privilege that gives you flat 5% dev cost. Protestants can choose the church aspect for another minus 5 dev cost globally. Trade company districts give 15% dev cost in the entire state. Jesuits and Kadiri holy orders give an additional 5% dev cost in the entire state. And finally, all sources of all power costs, of course, reduce dev cost, which includes innovativeness as well as golden age. And this is all the dev cost modifiers without any ideas, without any policies, and without any missions triggered. It is quite a lot. In multiplayer games, players will stack 10 plus of these on one province, and this is why you can see many players reach 3 to 5 mana to develop in many of their provinces, and it's not unusual. And it's also very common to see 2,000 plus total dev clicks in a singular campaign per nation. Despite stacking dev cost reduction, there are other aspects to developing we need to talk about, like what do you develop first? Early game, we want to look at our nation and see what we have the most valuable in terms of trade goods. In the trade node, we have the most control. We will talk about early expansion and where you want to expand later in this video, as it is part of scaling. But yes, trade goods. Trade goods in EU4 have different value that will increase and decrease throughout the game. Good trade goods to focus on in the beginning are, of course, gold, copper, gems, salt, iron, glass, and cloth. Might have missed a couple in there, but those are the general ones that are pretty good. If you're not sure, just look at the trade value in the bottom right of the province screen. The way it works is that you get the production value based off of the goods that you produce, but you also get the trade value of what you produce in the node that it is in. So in this example, we have iron. We're producing 1 goods produced here. We dev 5 times, that makes it to 2 goods produced, which means that we produce 2 iron per year, which means that we make 6 trade value per year from that node. Divide that by 12. That's how much additional trade income per month that we're also making from that development. Of course, in this example, Castile doesn't fully control its own node, so we actually even get a percentage further of that. For that reason, Diplo deving always will scale better than admin deving in terms of ducats, because not only do we get a flat goods produced increase that affects our production income per dip development, we also get money through trade due to that flat goods produced. Then that value gets basically percentage of the node that we control, and then it gets increased by our trade efficiency. The reason why I'm explaining all of this is because this is why players will always try to prioritize dip deving in nodes they control, because you're only actually getting a part of the money in production. The main thing is you're getting money from trade. So to make the most money early on, we dip dev the highest trade value good in the node with the most trade control, that is the cheapest to develop. The cheapest overall province to develop, we want to save for military development. Mil developing, in my eyes and many multiplayer players' eyes, is more valuable than dip developing and admin developing, which is why we want to focus so much on making as much military points as possible. That way we can use our extra mil points to develop our military and get more manpower. Each point of mill developing gives a flat amount of manpower, which is how we're able to field such big armies so fast. We want to keep the cheapest province for mill developing if the total mill dev on that province is less than 11 and that province has an accepted culture, as non-accepted cultures get a minus manpower malus. The ideal development on a good trade good is something like 1-9-11. However, in early game, it's not uncommon to see a good trade good like copper or gold having 12 or 14 Diplo dev to maximize profit. We're going to want to use expand infrastructure as much as possible and use government and state privileges to get more governing capacity, or downgrade expand infrastructure in the cases where we want to develop more and have no more instances of governing capacity increase. Of course, that's also what core houses are for, and we can spam those throughout our land to get more governing capacity. Continue the topic of development efficiency, we always want to make sure we are deving with level 3 trade centers, as they give minus 10 dev costs in the entire state, and if we cannot afford to upgrade to level 3, we should instead focus on developing states without trade centers until we can afford that upgrade to level 3, as it's more efficient and will save you mana on the long term. If you want to min-max to the fullest, when you're at max amount of level 3 trade centers, we can downgrade a trade center from level 3 to level 2 in states that we are done developing in, and then focus on another state that we have not developed yet, then upgrade that one to level 3. If we are truly min-maxing, we focus on developing state by state rather than what is cheapest. I'm guilty of doing this due to laziness, where I'll just develop whatever is cheapest. However, it is more efficient to focus on a state by state basis. Burger loyalty is also another global dev cost that you should always be deving with. It is really important as it gives minus 10% dev cost reduction globally. If it's not possible to have a stagnant or constant plus 60% loyalty, we can develop in what is called a dev cycle, where we stack our mana, then develop in big chunks when we sell titles, as this will give us a temporary boost in loyalty. We'll talk more about selling titles later in this video. Golden Age is also another huge source of dev cost reduction, and it is wise to click Golden Age when we have a good ruler and good advisors in order to dev more than without Golden Age. In the early game, building temples, churches / mosques is another way to get another additional 5% dev cost, but keep in mind you might have to delete those buildings later for more valuable buildings, which is what we will talk about next. Buildings are what scale us to the next level. While developing gives flat bonuses, non-manufacturing buildings in most cases give us percentage increases. Obviously, we want to stack as much construction cost as possible. Unlike dev cost, construction cost does not have as many stackable modifiers, so you don't really see as often crazy construction costs. You can get to like half or even below that, stacking the things that I'm about to tell you right now. If your ruler is an architectural visionary, it gives your nation a minus 10% construction cost globally. Embracing Renaissance gives your nation 5% construction cost globally. If you are Orthodox, you can use the Christ Pantocrator icon for 10% con cost. If you are a feudal theocracy, you can use seize clerical holdings government action to get minus 15% con cost. As Hindu, you can use the Ganga deity for 10% con cost. If you are Indian and have the Jains estate, you can get minus 10 con cost for having Jains at above 60% influence. Catholics can get minus 10% con cost from Levi church taxes, Holy See interaction. Protestants can get a temporary 10% construction cost through organized through bishops. Nations with parliament and economic ideas can use appropriate land for state debate to get 5% con cost reduction. Nations with guilds can use guild interaction to get between 10 to 15% con cost reduction. Many nations will have construction cost reduction missions that will last between 10 to 50 years. However, I recommend using this mission when you're building manufactories, as it will be the most valuable. Provinces that produce tropical wood get minus 20% construction cost. States with the Carthusians Holy Order will give an additional 10% construction cost reduction in the entire state. Provinces in the HRE will get 5% construction cost reduction if the HRE emperor has passed the imperial reform call for Reichsreform. This doesn't give construction costs, but we should mention inflation. It gives positive construction costs, so it's important that when you're building a lot of buildings, you're near or at 0% inflation. So when talking about building buildings in the most efficient manner, trade buildings in provinces with trade centers will increase trade control, which is important to not lose goods that we are producing. Workshops scale amazingly with Diplo development and should be built in conjunction with Diplo developing, as mentioned earlier in the video. Churches are also a nice way to boost your income in the early game, as well as giving you 5% dev costs. However, we should consider the return of investment on churches, because in some provinces we may have to delete the churches later on in the game to make space for other buildings that are more valuable. Manpower buildings are very valuable and should not be ignored, as manpower is very important in winning player wars. Land force limit buildings should be considered as an economic building, as they will increase force limit and allow us to have bigger armies without getting negative effects and negative maintenance. While manufactories are the biggest increase in money, as they are like developing DipDev 5 times in terms of good produced and should be highly prioritized when scaling income. If you add that in conjunction with workshops, that is the fastest way to increase money in terms of buildings. Add a manufactory, then add a workshop. Add a manufactory and add a workshop. This is why if you watch me play on my stream, you'll see that around Tech 11, I stack a lot of ducats, because that's when we unlock a lot of the manufactories for trade goods such as iron, copper, cloth, and naval supplies. If you're in Africa, you kind of feel that effect around Tech 14 and Tech 16, as many of the goods in Africa, such as ivory, gems, slaves, do not get manufactories until 14 and 16. So with all that basic stuff out of the way, what buildings do we focus on first? The real juice, the real content here. Well, there's no broad answer for this question. If we're struggling with trade being stolen from our node, we want to focus on that by building trade buildings and increasing trade centers, although we want to prioritize trade centers for developing. If we feel we're diplomatically safe and we do not have any major wars on the horizons, it's okay to fully focus on money buildings, like manufactories, workshops, and temples, so we can scale faster. However, keep in mind that players are able to see their relative strength compared to you in the rival screen, and if they feel they are much stronger, might change diplomacy or attack you unexpectedly. Keep in mind, in multiplayer, it is very greedy to ignore military buildings, as they are vital to winning wars. In an ideal situation, we spend early on building a lot of our production, tax, and manufactories, and when we're about to go to war, we build our manpower and force limit buildings. However, it's rare that we are in an ideal situation, so it's better that we also just put in the manpower and force limit buildings as we build up and get stronger, in order to maintain that strength in case we do end up in a war. A full built country is a country where every single province has a production building, a manufactory, a force limit building, a manpower building, and a soldier's household. Of course, it's not always possible to have expanded infrastructure on every province, so we prioritize manufactory or soldier's household depending on the trade good. And since we are abusing expand infrastructure on all of our provinces, we're going to need governing capacity buildings like courthouses on almost all of our provinces as we reach that governing capacity. And as mentioned earlier, universities are super duper important for developing efficiently, and once we get Tech 17, we do not want to develop at all unless we have a university on the province. As we get more techs and we get new buildings unlocked, we may want to reduce our advisor cost, and this is a situational basis if we feel like we're not making enough money in order to afford that new building. Sometimes building all of that new building is more important than generating a little bit more mana. Of course, this is a temporary thing, and as soon as we're done building, we upgrade our advisors back to the level that they were at. It should be mentioned that as we build, using the macro builder is not enough, and we have to go around our nation looking for yellow provinces, which signifies that there is no building slot available for that building. We need to then go to each yellow province and determine whether we need to delete a building, dev to the next building slot, or expand infrastructure to fit that vital building in that province. This leads us to our next segment of this video, early and general expansion. Developing and buildings are not the only aspects of scaling that need to be discussed. We need to also talk about expansion, especially early expansion. It should be noted that in my opinion, many new players feel like they need to expand too much, which is actually a hindrance. The main objective of our earliest expansion is to secure a trade node. Of course, not all trade nodes are equal, as most trade nodes flow into other trade nodes. So if we are not in an end node, it's important we have some kind of control upstream in order to fully control our trade node, especially in vanilla where downstream trade power is insane, which is why most multiplayer mods nerf downstream trade power and buff provincial trade power. Getting most of the value of a node is important to not lose value from our diplo deving as well as our manufactories. Once we secure a trade node, it's good to focus on internal building and scaling rather than further expanding. In this case, not all nations are equal. Some nations like England can secure the value of their main trade node quite easily, while others like Poland will probably suffer with lost trade value all game. Note, there are exceptions to the early trade node control, like Spain plus Portugal. If you're in a node sharing it with another player, if both players are contributing heavily to the value of the node and it's shared equally, it can be actually beneficial to keeping that player in that node. In the case of Spain plus Portugal, the Spain player develops Iberia, bringing a considerable amount of value in the node, while Portugal should be bringing in value from the New World and Africa. This can be mimicked with other nations as well, such as Japan and Korea. In the early game, in order to be efficient, we want to avoid conquering lands we do not have claims on, as our admin power is the most valuable in the stage of the game. Of course, we can't always have the luxury of claim, so we gotta conquer, but please keep that in mind. Not only do we want to expand our own lands to gain more power, but we also need to keep up an admin tech so we do not fall behind in ideas. Having an idea group and not having an idea group can be the difference between winning and losing a war. If we are in an area with tons of AI, it's better to do a couple show strengths as we expand, since aggressive expansion needs to be considered. The earlier you do the show strength wars, the better. As you get stronger and scale harder, less nations will be valid rivals. If you are in an area with lots of players, expanding into as much AI as possible is important as long as other players are expanding as well. Aggressive expansion can break in multiplayer games if all players get a lot of aggressive expansion, as the AI is not sure who to coalition since there are too many coalition targets. After this early game expansion period when there's no more AI, weighing expansion into players over internal development usually comes down to a control of node and how built up you are. If you control a node quite significantly and have no buildings and not developed a lot, it's probably a bad idea to keep expanding unless you have an AI target to keep expanding into. Keep in mind that a player war can easily turn into a death war if we are not fully prepared, and it can ruin our scaling for 10 to 20 years or even get us out of the game. With all the topics we discussed in this video, this really comes down to feeling out the game and player experience, which is why you can watch this guide, but in reality you need to play a lot of EU4 MP or play EU4 in order to feel it out and understand when it's time to expand and when is it time to build up. And I'm not trying to say that to scare you guys away from EU4 MP, rather the opposite. I want you guys to play EU4 MP because it's a fun experience and we have lots of games going on my Discord, which you can join by joining in the description. But you do need to play the game in order to get that perfect equilibrium between expansion and scaling. And to end this section of the video, or this segment of the video, I should mention that the trade node rule applies for most countries in EU4. However, keep in mind some nations such as France get a very high bonuses to tax, and you can stack a bunch of tax bonuses, which allows you to focus on just tax income in the early stages of the game in order to boost your economy without having to focus on the whole trade node aspect of the game. Selling of titles is an important way to get money in EU4. In a way, in vanilla, it's actually too much money, and without it, we won't scale as hard as someone who's able to sell titles on cooldown in the early stages of the game. However, there is a balance of selling titles and having too low crownlands, which is why we usually will seize crownlands after selling if we are not developing any lands and using the burger loyalty bonus. Generally speaking, if we are a duchy rank government, it's ideal to stay above 20% crownlands. If we are a kingdom, it's ideal to stay above 10% crownlands, and if we're an empire, and it's ideal to stay over 5%. The reason for that is because of the autonomy gain in our provinces. In the early stages of the game, it's okay to be under these values, especially as a duchy, as long as we keep in mind to reduce autonomy as much as possible whenever a province goes over 25% autonomy. Since we can reduce autonomy every 30 years manually, we have to think in terms of those 30-year blocks. If we are gaining 0.025 autonomy per month, the math is over the course of 30 years, the autonomy will go up by 9. If our autonomy is going up by 0.125% a month, over the course of 30 years, it will become 45% more autonomy, which with the reduction will go down to 20%, so it's manageable as long as we are not having an increase in autonomy forever. General rule of thumb to make this simple is that we want to sell titles if we can. Seize back some crownlands after developing, and then reduce autonomy every 30 years in provinces over 25% autonomy. In vanilla, the bonuses of having a lot of crownland do not outweigh the short-term money boosts unless we are going for absolutism. Most mods increase bonuses of crownland, so keep that in mind. This will give an increase in rebels, but in multiplayer, we should be near force limit at all times anyway, since we need to be prepared if we get declared on. Be lower than force limit is greedy, and we should keep that in mind while we play. To finish off this video, here are some tips to keep in mind while playing and while building up and scaling. First tip is to look out for stability. Ideally, we are always sitting at +3 stability for positive pulse events. If you are unable to do so due to lack of admin power, then +1 stability is fine. That is enough to gain prosperity in our states. Keep in mind, the higher your stability is, the higher your prosperity grow, and also the higher your tax income. The next tip is to try to avoid developing purely using the macro builder. I'm guilty of doing this a lot due to laziness, but it's better to use it to see what state you should focus on next. Try not to develop without prosperity and level 3 trade centers if possible. The next tip is to always try to develop manpower first in provinces, as the more development a province gets, the more expensive it will be to develop. If we focus manpower first on our provinces, you will in the end get more manpower development out of your nation. The next tip is to use state edicts as much as possible. In vanilla, never dev without development edict. It's also important to note that in your capital state to always be running a state edict, as it is essentially free. Later on, when you have more courthouses, we should have state edicts on essentially all states at all times. The manpower one, especially later on, is very valuable as it gives 33% manpower in the entire state. Our next tip is that mana and monarch points are more valuable than ducats. We already mentioned it, but it doesn't hurt to say it again. If you can trade monarch points for ducats, do it. Trust me. The next tip is that forts are very important for defense, but also for dealing with devastation. Having forts in states is a great way to decrease devastation and keep you defended, so build them. Our next tip is drilling troops is not worth unless we have fully built up or near built up or about to declare or feel we're about to be declared on. Keep in mind some mods buff drilling, why is that so hard to say? So keep that in mind. My final tip for you guys is to know your mission tree and see where it gives bonuses like construction costs, dev costs, claims for your expansion, and other bonuses to your nation. Many times, triggering your missions as the right moment can have a much bigger impact than just going with your missions as you get them. Which is why when you watch me play sometimes, you'll see that I have the mission notification and I'm not using the mission. And with that, the guide video is now done. You are now ready to play EU4 and scale and build up. I hope you learned stuff from this in order to help you out with your EU4 gaming, and if you're looking to play some EU4 multiplayer, join my Discord. We're always looking for players to fill in slots in our games. Special thanks to Keglas or Key for helping with the script of this video, which ended up being almost 13 pages long. Thanks, Key. Really appreciate you and having you part of my community. If you want to check him out, his Twitch will also be in the description. He's a great player, great scaler, great builder up, and check him out. Thank you for watching. You can support me on Patreon, link in description, and you can always watch me play on my Twitch at twitch.tv/absolutehabibi. Speaking of Patreons, thank you Lumina, Amir, and Mason Andruska for being my top supporters this month. Check out my Patreon if you want to get some sick perks, and that's it.